Who are we covering today?
I guess Augustus is anxious to get right into our normal conversation.
I'm just curious. I have no idea. They don't tell me these things.
So as we noted, we are discussing Daphne Oram today. Yeah, kind of a big one. Someone that is considered the godmother of electronic music.
The founder of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
Yeah, which was sort of the answer to what was going on in Europe. Like we've discussed Pierre Schaeffer in Paris. We haven't touched on Stockhausen yet, but he was over in Germany. Doing things with tape music, experimenting. And so in England, they started the BBC Radiophonic Workshop.
Well, let's talk a little bit about like the backstory there.
About how she started it?
She pretty much, let's
There's so many angles that we could start from, so.
Early life. Apparently, from when she was 7 years old, she could visualize sound.
Sound, yes.
She was into,
very gifted child, very interested in sound.
She said that someday there would be a way for her to create the sound that she visualizes.
That she would be able to draw it. I'm pretty sure she was very specific at age 7. This is the anecdote. That she told her father one day she would build a machine that she could draw and it would make sound. She must have had this way of experiencing sound that was visual. That she was like, I know if I could communicate sound visually, this would be...
We won't spoil that part because, So that's just an idea. That was a thought that she had when she was 7. Whether or not it actually happened is yet to be discussed.
And, I'd like to just point on that she was born in 1925, so between the two world wars. So she was an adult during World War II. And a lot of the people that we've talked about were involved some way in the war effort, and that's how they got into telecommunications or radio or electronic music, was by being exposed to the tools, the tubes, and what have you. And the technology, the education was through the military. And she has a similar trajectory.
It was said that because of, the fact that men were called off to war.
Oh yeah, this is a fun
She was able to wrangle a job as a balancing engineer. A balancing engineer.
Tell me more about being a balancing engineer. What does that even mean?
In the old days, I believe that it was kind of like you're mixing and mastering all in one. Before the advent of multi-track recording and tape, a balancing engineer was sort of the person responsible for getting the levels right that ultimately became the final recording, because that's really all you got, like one shot at it. Yeah, there wasn't as much to it. You might balance some levels and then whatever medium you're recording it to, that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, I do find it very interesting that she was able to get a job that she normally wouldn't have been able to get just because of the war, and that all the men were off at war. So it's actually here on her Wikipedia page, which I know we could all be reading together. Anyone can find that. But specifically about being a music balancer at the BBC, that one of her job responsibilities was shadowing live concerts with a pre-recorded version, so the broadcast would go on if interrupted by enemy action. She did also create sound effects for radio shows and mixing broadcast levels. During this time when she's working at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, at BBC, at the radio, working as a music balancer, she became aware that, there were experiments being done with synthetic sound and tape recorders. So the real pivotal moment is when she was told that she was allowed to go and dig through sort of redundant equipment that was kind of in storage, and use it after hours and work on these ideas that she had.
Well, she really had to press for it.
Yeah.
She had to basically beg someone to let her use equipment when it was not being used. Only she would use it and then return it.
Yeah, that
perfectly.
Was so crazy. She would put everything back. She would take things from all over the place. She would stay there all night, work on stuff. The tedious work of recording things to tape and splicing and looping and all of that. She would do it all night and then put it back. And then go to work in the morning?
It reminds me of that story where like the elves are like in the shoe shop like working all night, and then like everything gets returned back to normal when the owner like arrives.
Yeah, she's a little tape music elf.
Yeah.
Very magical. So she was pretty much on her own doing all of this.
I'm referencing.
How did Desmond Briscoe get involved?
This book, it's Tape Leaders by Ian Helliwell, a very good reference for all things British electronic music and tape music pioneers. But it says that through the dedication and support of Desmond Briscoe and sympathetic drama producers, the Radiophonic Workshop came into being in April of 1958.
I see. So it was started in 1958, and she needed...
This was the same year that
he sort of was like her sponsor. He sort of was like, all right, I'll vouch for her. We have an interest in this. I know that, you know, the initial setup was to create, you know, radio dramas. And I was just listening to what they consider the first radiophonic radio show or performance that was done. The Private Dreams and... What is it? Public Dreams and Private Nightmares. I need to find that. The sort of announcer, the guy who's presenting it, the voiceover, describes that, you know, this is the first of its kind, and he's introducing it to the public who are listening, and he's sharing that you know, they didn't want to call it music as they might call it in other parts of Europe where it's being experimented with. So that's why they called it radiophonics, because they thought it should specifically be used for radio dramas, where for this, you know, performance, they did a poem that they used tape music to enhance the mood. So they were talking about how it's not necessarily for music and it's not necessarily for sound effects. It's something in between where it enhances the experience. It's kind of like a psychological perspective, where they thought, you know, it does lend itself very easily to sort of spooky sounds and abrasive things. He mentioned horror and things like that. And they were interested in how can they find a niche with tape music at the BBC, where it's more for subtle emotions, sadness, grief. You know, we associate it a lot with like sort of a haunting, you know, digging through memories and things like that, sort of a dream state. So Daphne was part of that initial project.
So 1958 was the same year that she visited the Brussels World Fair. Yeah, she heard electronic music from people overseas, I guess.
Oh, so that's where she was really exposed to Stockhausen and Schaefer.
She was also in regular contact with F.C. Judd, someone who
they did correspond.
I am sure that we will cover.
Yeah, we're gonna have to.
He was another pioneer.
So she was really connected with whoever the pioneers at the time were. She was in contact, or she was aware of them. You know, after founding the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and doing these experiments, she actually didn't stay very long.
She was only there for about 6 months.
Yeah, and there's a strange reason why that we want to learn more about. There was a rule at the time that you could only be exposed to strange sounds for 6 months at a time, and then you had to go work in another department. And then I guess, 6 months on, 6 months off? I'm not sure the exact timeline. But you weren't allowed to spend more than 6 months around these strange electronic sounds. I don't know why they thought it was dangerous or what they thought was going to happen.
I get it, though. I mean, weird stuff, man.
I feel like I have so many questions about like who made that rule up and why. He basically said, I don't want to work anywhere else. I started this. I want to stay here. So she left and she founded a electronic studio in her house. She moved to Kent. And she founded what they say is probably the first electronic music studio in Britain. And
aside from the radio,
it really was just, you know, a house that she lived in, and she had, I think, chickens and goats and cats, and apparently she had a lovely garden, and she cooked and worked on what the next chapter of her life is and what her real legacy is beyond the Radiophonic Workshop is the Oramics Machine. That famous machine that she told her father she would make one day.
Right. And I find it interesting that, you know, we've discussed many of these electronic music pioneers, and a lot of them seem to have this one machine. You know, like you've got your Totos, you've got your
Tontos.
Tontos, sorry.
For a second I was like, wait, is that something I don't know about?
Your Electroniums.
Yes.
You know, like what's the one for...
Troutoniums.
Yeah, Troutoniums.
Your Theremins.
So, you know, this was her machine. Like she had...
Oh my gosh, it's incredible. She had demonstrations. I think on the weekends, it said. She would, people like, most of the people we know from the Radiophonic Workshop would come out and kind of get the demonstration of the machine. And it was always being worked on.
It was rumored that Mick Jagger and somebody from the Beatles...
So in 1962, she was awarded a grant that's equivalent to £76,000 today. From the Gulbenkian Foundation.
Gulbenkian, that's right.
To create the Oramics system. And then she got another one a couple years later. That was probably, I don't know, they don't say how much that one was worth, but close to probably £80,000 today. With the expectation, I think that it was going to be, you know, functional within a few years and be this big breakthrough in technology that they could then develop further. But it turns out that she spent her whole life working on it and then just kind of gave up I think in the 70s.
She gave up, but she switched to Apple.
She did. She switched to Apple computers in, I guess, the early 80s.
I think even with, it says she used the Apple II, but I think even like, you know, back then they had like light pins. That was like an accessory that you could have with the computer.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
And you could use that to, you know, kind of like draw a basic waveform, and you could get, you know, the sound that you wanted that way. It's no surprise to me that she ended up going the computer route, because her vision, you know, basically took that direction. You know, like there was never really a formal machine, like electromechanical machine that did this. It happened.
It never happened that way.
It never happened that way. It went, you know, the computer was the winner in that race. But I'm one of these people that, like, I love film, I love tape, I love these, you know, electromechanical processes, I love analog. You know, so I always have these like crazy dreams where, you know, like what if, you know, the technology of like the 60s and 70s had just been continued, you know,
instead of
even though they weren't practical. Like what if the same effort
the amount
would have been put into, you know, if aliens came and...
Oh no, it has to involve aliens.
and, you know, put the same effort that, you know, showed us all these devices, that they put the same effort we put into computers, but in keeping analog, you know, moving forward. Like, you know, what kind of stuff would we have come up with? And I think that the Oramics Machine would have been one of those kind of devices where we would, you know, be doing these elaborate, you know, film, you know, art, you know, visual art turning into sound type projects. I feel like it
is very unique. I don't know if there's anyone who was doing something similar. That's going to be a question that I have.
I do believe that we have shared stuff. Wasn't there...
Well, there was a group of Soviet pioneers who were drawing on film back in, I want to say, the 20s.
Yeah, early on.
Very early on, and that was really cool. But this is something a little bit different because she's drawing, but she's also building the machine to generate the sound.
Oh, I see. So it had sort of like a custom sound generation device that specifically went along, because they were using standard film projectors to read, because like a sound film projector, for example, reads sort of like a drawing, you know, or a wave shape that's recorded onto sound film, onto a magnetic strip. So it's like oxide. I think it's the same technology as tape. is used for that process. But I was gonna say, if it was in the 20s, like there was a lot more experimentation with like electromechanical means for, you know, people were trying to figure out what was gonna be basically tape.
Yeah, because they were using, there was a lot of experimentation specifically at that time
To try to figure out what
with
the best
different
way,
recording techniques,
you know,
machines that were
to
very
record
dangerous.
sound and wire recorders and oil cans and all
They were
kinds of
very
stuff.
proprietary things that never developed into what we have now. It just kind of went to tape. Her machine was really homemade. Almost looks like it's taped together. You know, like how did this thing work at all? It looks like it never worked. And I heard one of the curators say that there's no possible way to restore it because anything they do using stuff we have now would make it not what it was. It would no longer be the Oramics machine.
Was it tube based?
Yes.
Gotcha, that's why. Well, the little
What was going on?
the little that I know about tubes, like the whole deal with tubes is that like if she referenced certain types of tubes, there are tubes that used to exist that, you know, would allow you to do certain functions that there literally isn't like a solid state replacement for. So like if she referenced using a tube in a certain way, there's literally no way that you can like recreate those same series of actions with something that's available now. So it's like, and then that would screw up the whole logic of the circuit kind of thing. Like, so it makes sense to me how it wouldn't be possible, you know, to recreate some of those ideas.
It's also just, it was always being fiddled with. She was always trying out some other adaptation on it. So it's hard to know what version would we have now to even recreate or to fix. So it's really just sort of a piece of history that is non-functional, that just is going to sit in a museum, which I think is a good thing because there's a lot to discuss about it, and I'm glad that they found it and that we can see like her handwriting is on it and things like that.
It's a very
But
cool
yeah, she just
bit,
fiddled with it all day, every day, her entire life, just on this machine. She had these moments, I think, probably between 1960 and 1968, where she was doing Lego commercials and she was in adverts for tape machines and she was really cutting edge, and there were little mini documentaries about her on BBC promoting the Oramics Machine. But then
I think she was
everything kind of
sponsored by
dried up.
Brunel. There's a lot of Brunel ads. They were
I love the Brunel ads.
a British tape machine company. Apparently that's the brand that the Beatles had at home.
Oh.
They were
considered the best.
Yeah, they were kind of like the Ampex of Great Britain.
Oh, okay.
In a lot of her
Making it
songs,
musical.
so to speak, you could tell that the whole point of them were, and it just hit me that like I probably do that a lot too, but like they were almost like experiments in sound. Like you could tell that like if you listen to each piece, you're like, oh, well,
She was trying to do this, yeah.
She was really interested in the idea of like recording this band and seeing what would happen if she like sped up and slowed down the tape throughout their performance. Would it like create this different, you know, vibe? You know, and it's almost like she would do music to explore certain techniques in the studio, which I think is kind of common with a lot of these types of artists as well. Like, you know, they use making recorded bits that, you know, we end up like worshiping as, you know, the examples of their work, but their point in doing them was more from like a technical standpoint of like, you know, how do I explore this one concept? You know, I want to do a tape flange, you know, like across an entire track, and that's what the whole sound piece is. But I'm just like, I love that song.
I think that's probably where we'll end for now on Daphne. And we'll obviously continue in the group throughout the week, unless you have any closing thoughts.
I guess my final note would be, you know, that her work was like a never-ending ripple throughout electronic music as we know it. Like, you know, not only did she found the Radiophonic Workshop, but the experiments and her sort of style, I mean, it's almost, you know, one could almost say that she invented the techniques that they used, in the Radiophonic Workshop. Not necessarily that she invented tape editing, but she kind of like laid a foundation for how it was done. You know what I mean? Because she spoke with such authority.
How it was used with the radio programs and things like that.
And she spoke with such authority and was so confident in the way that she thought about sound that it was like she would sort of just like, do things and people would sort of like, that's how it's done, She kind of like set like a precedent.
They do, they say she's the godmother of electronic music.
Right. So, the fact that, she was that influential, that blows my mind. Like, to think that,
powerful.
Almost the whole point in our group, the Cosmic Tape Music Club, and, a lot of the techniques that we use with our music and everything, it would, who knows what it would, if it would even exist if it wasn't for Daphne Oram.
Yeah.
So big, she's a heavy hitter.
She's a heavy hitter for sure.
Beyond
feels like a big thing to honor her. And
really comprehension in my...
To even, talk about her. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us on this cosmic conversation. Hope that you are staying safe and healthy and calm, and feel free to reach out to us. We're here for you. All right, we'll talk to you next time.
Bye now.